Useful anger. What is to be done with it, this anger that dare not be swallowed? Should it be diluted with denial, cooled with indifference? Should it be sweetened with good intention or softened with lies? Should it be spewed out red hot over searing tongues, scorching the guilty and the innocent alike? What is to be done with it, this anger that we dare not swallow? Don't dilute it, deny it, or cool it. Don't sweeten or soften it, but pause for a moment. Could you hold it before your eyes? Examine it with your heart and mind. Could you hold it, then touch it to your belly, that place where your soul rests? Could you let it enter there, knowing it is part of you that needs to be treated kindly, that needs to be listened to, that needs to be honored, for it has the power to save you, to save us all. One Sunday afternoon after church, or before church, a cheeky, smart friend of mine asked me what my prophecy was about today. It tickled me. People don't use the word prophecy much unless they're being cheeky, or unless they're thinking, in UU churches at least, more about crystal balls or Nostradamus, or they're just being cynical. But as a church and as a minister, we sort of have to focus on the small stuff, but also on the big stuff, moral decisions, cultural wrongs, sins. And I think that what this is not so much a prophecy as much as it is maybe a parable. So I thought I would take the idea of following the idea of a mortgage crisis. Michael shared with me a book called Popular Delusions. What's the full title?
Extremely Popular Delusions and Madness of the Crowds.
I have the book. I returned it. And that phrase and the theme of this book is that, we can get caught up in things that are just, seem rational but are not. And, I sort of carried that book around with me. I read it a little bit. And Michael Lewis, who is the author of one of the many pieces about the mortgage crisis, drew up the same book and the same theme. So I thought I was in pretty good company in sort of framing it this way. And being the son of a builder and talking about housing, I thought it was sort of fun to construct and deconstruct the idea of the mortgage crisis in sort of an immoral way. So there's lots of places to begin that. A story of moral delusions, I guess. And the U.S. mortgage crisis, what we might really call the subprime mortgage crisis of the late 2000s, about 5 years ago, you certainly would remember that, was caused by a set of conditions beginning with the rise in subprime mortgages. And I'd say that I'm sort of sharing this. I wrote this just sort of last year when it was clear that there was not going to be that many indictments, that nobody was really going to go to prison for this, and lots of people lost a lot of money. And I sort of began to investigate that and thought I'd share it in a way I hope is helpful. It's certainly none of us are, it's not novel to any of us, but it's helpful to review it and remember how things happen, I think. So it's caused by a set of conditions, sort of beginning with the rise in subprime mortgages being lent out, right? Subprime mortgages being bad mortgages lent out to people who haven't fully disclosed the amount of money they have, liberal credit lines, liberal uses looking into their economic backgrounds. It also probably began in some part because there was a flush of money into the markets in the United States from overseas oil countries, and trying to get to invest in areas where there was, the investment, the rates of interest were very low after 9/11. They wanted to encourage investment. So there was a flood of money that came into the United States. And this sort of unfolding kind of crisis of economic and morality, we call the crisis, began when a quite predictable rise in the delinquencies of these mortgages were lent out to people who basically couldn't afford them. And that sort of began to happen in 2006 and 2007. And these mortgages led to, obviously, a large number of foreclosures. And with a large number of foreclosures comes the decline in housing prices. And then the securities that were sold There were financial instruments built. They were packaged. They were, mortgage-backed securities were basically created, and they were generally often balanced out so that there was high-risk stuff packaged in. Some of these like highly speculative mortgages were packaged in with more solid mortgages, and eventually, slowly, those began to kind of fall apart. Not quite so much fall apart as lost their value, initially at least. And because at that moment, so much of our national bank's money had been bet on the housing market that it became very difficult for them. There was a crisis in money to be loaned out, right? So there was an additional sort of expense to the economy, and that came from the fact that people couldn't get loans to foster businesses and such things. And that crisis in confidence and the decline of capital led to global effects that trickled around the world, as we remember. And also, although it's important to sort of talk about how it all falls apart, it's probably more important to think about how it gets constructed a little bit, how we fall into that pattern of behavior. To me, there are more moral lessons found the other way, I think, than the other way around. So economic speculation and bubbles sort of happen all the time. There's been tulip bubbles, and there was the tech bubble of not too far away. And I think that it's probably important to look at that. So, as my dad says, it was the sort of the building blocks of this were built on the fact that there wasn't a lot of other things to speculate on at that time. And there was a sense in the economy from many people, just broadly shared, from banks to the average citizen, that housing was a solid place to invest. It was a thing. It wasn't, we're following the tech bubble. It wasn't a internet company that sprang up in Silicon Valley somewhere. God isn't making any more real estate, and there seems to be more and more of us, right? Owning a home is the American dream, so investing is an encouraging kind of thing to do. Confidence in housing was driven by the fact that at no point really in 2006 had anyone in most memories seen a decline in the general economy or a significant long-term decline in housing prices. There is, I think, 1 year right following World War II where housing prices for an entire year go down. 1 year in the 60 years or years that followed World War II when housing didn't increase in its value. You've got a lot of foreign money created that wants to have a part of that, right? So there's a speculation. At the bedrock of our crisis was the assumption investing in housing, getting poor people into their own homes, was a good idea. Investing in housing felt like a powerful idea. Conservative strategist Karl Rove, who we all know, he said that he believed that creating more homeowners was good for the Republican Party, and that it was, was essentially building a culture of people who would think like conservatives. And he's probably right. And George Bush, even up to the time that it was almost comical to say so, touted the number of homeowners as a sign that the economy was strong. You might remember that sort of piece of inconsistency. But the Democrats are part of this too, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they were encouraging people who really didn't have the economic viability into home ownership as well. No one had remembered the nation really moving backward for any length of time. We have to remember that almost everyone buying a home, be it a starter home or their third investment condo, or a banker buying one of these multi-stacked securities, had that feeling. We also have sort of not known that, or seen quite maybe as much as we see it today, that the American economy had really built its assumptions of always upward and upwardly mobile only in a relatively small period of time. So, with the internet bubble having burst in the late 90s, housing became the best last place to speculate, and Essentially, banks created more mortgages by getting more people into these relationships, and were essentially in the process creating more of these securities to package and sell. They were creating financial instruments to bring money into the market and to get people into homes together. The fact that this had to happen is that people had to get comfortable with the idea of carrying debt. And the average American was carrying lots of debt is a relatively new phenomenon. In fact, from 1990, the average household, their disposable income to what they held in debt was 77%. So people really had, relatively speaking, much lower debt. By the time 2007 came around, that number had gone from 77% to 127%. That's a significant, like 70-ish% increase in the amount of debt that people were holding in their households in simply just a 17-year period. So debt had to become an acceptable form of what people lived with and felt comfortable with. And really that is connected to, most of that debt was housing, but a lot of that debt was credit cards as well. That was the boom in the credit card loaning too. The other thing that had to happen was that people needed to be given loans. There was traditionally always been subprime loans, and people paid high rates of interest on those loans. And generally, traditionally, that had hovered around 8% of all mortgages given out were subprime loans. I don't know exactly where they get that figure, but it's sort of prior to this boom. I guess the general theme was that I don't have the data on that specifically, but about 8% is the normal sense. But by 2004 and at the end in 2006, the percentage of people getting subprime loans was 26%. People were getting into riskier loans. It wasn't showing because housing prices were continually going up. You were a fool not to be in housing. You could buy a house, and we all remember this, and in 4 months, that house is worth another $10,000, if not worth another $50,000 for a period of time. So more and more people stretched to get into that class of homeowners, people who otherwise wouldn't have qualified. And by 2006, the risky loans had grown to 20%, and in Nevada and California and Phoenix and Florida, to name the most places where that had stretched the most, those numbers were even more. Those numbers were greater. At the exact same time that people were getting into subprime loans and people were being loaned money, came the invention, more or less, the increase in use of adjustable rate mortgages. So they flourished one another, and computers have a large part of this too. You can't do a lot of this modeling. You can't do the mortgage-backed securities without financial instrumentation that facilitates that and facilitates making this a global phenomenon to a degree. All of this always comes together. But adjustable rates mortgages didn't really matter to most people. So an adjustable rate mortgage, the average one in about somewhere like 3 to 5 years would take a relatively low rate and it would just boom. It was called, they call it a, what do they call that? A balloon. And most people didn't care about those balloons. They were provided a hedge to the mortgage people who were loaning to riskier people more money, but they also provided a source of income because they had seen that they were going to bubble and they were going to collect rates because the rates had been so low they needed to make more money off of them. People borrowing the money didn't seem to mind too much because they were most likely going to flip it, and the fact that housing prices went up so quickly, people could always readjust, and people were using their homes as ATM machines, which is a phrase we've probably all heard, right? So if your house is worth $50,000 more in 5 years, take the $50,000, you're back where you started, and you got $50,000 to spend. And all of that is fine until it just doesn't work anymore. So by the time 2000 came around, 90% of all the subprime mortgages being lent out were adjustable rate mortgages. So people were in very bad mortgages. So these rates were part about greed for the lenders. They were part about a hedge against the loan going bad. They were generally acceptable to those figuring that they could refinance. So they mattered little to a degree. They didn't show up immediately. But in 2006, some of these adjustable rates began to come clear, and people began to get foreclosed upon, and that trickled the cycle of people getting foreclosed upon and the housing market just basically dropping. That's the essential part of it. So it's harder to then repackage those loans as those things happen. I could explain it more probably, but I'm running out of time here, for me at least. So it was a great deal. You had to get into housing if you wanted to make money, because it was foolish to not have a house when you were paying rent to somebody who could do it. It was not unlike a card game, though. That card game, gin rummy, I believe, where you try to accumulate straights and flushes. Is that gin rummy? I couldn't. And if someone cashes out and cleans themselves out, you're stuck with a lot in your hand. That's essentially how it worked. You had great assets until the game changed, and then you were sort of stuck holding cards that you couldn't afford. So by 2010, 23% of all houses, all homes, were worth less than the mortgages that were taken by them. And for many people, as we all know, they owned a $400,000 house, they had a mortgage, a $400,000 mortgage on a house that was now all of a sudden in the last 4 months worth $250,000. So people either cashed out and just handed back the keys. People, they called it jingle mail, and people would just mail the keys back to the bankers and say, I'm out of here, I'm going bankrupt, take the house, I'm just out. So who's responsible for all that? Really kind of everyone, in a way. The reason there was almost no oversight on this latest round of speculation is that the institutions that would be monitoring the speculative behavior of everyone in this case were so infiltrated by the same type of thinking and so bought out by the banks that where such controls were almost non-existent. There were a few doubters in there. There were people who hedged bets against this system and saw what was coming. But for the most part, people were on the train riding it. So before the bubble burst, people could buy a house they couldn't afford because they went in without the need to document it. Another reason is that the complexity of the tools got so elaborate that even people within the big financial institutions had gone so far as to, in reports, I'm not going to cite the particular source, but they had gone so far as they didn't really even know what they were doing. They were so invested in the system, and the system was so complex with different derivatives, and they were cutting up these mortgage-backed securities in all these different ways and fending off different parts of them, that it became almost too confusing for anyone to follow, even including those doing it. The reviewing agencies that set the sort of quality of the loans, they were under the same delusion to a certain degree that that housing had really never failed. So things were getting AAA, security rankings when they certainly didn't deserve it. And part of that was because there wasn't enough money in the reviewing jobs, that they were kind of recruiting the sort of second grade talent. So the high-end sort of business talent from Harvard and people who kind of had sort of got a game on the system were just smarter than the reviewers and a step ahead. And the reviewing agencies were often generally paid by how many loans they processed rather than how much fraud they discovered in the acceptance. And a whole bunch of newly minted people were looking at these loans, and they were also paid by how many of these loans they processed through. So at every stage of the system, from the small person trying to get a loan to the big bankers selling off these massive mortgage-backed securities, the system generally benefited from passing on the risk and taking your cut and giving the veneer of legitimacy that each layer did than it was to look at it from afar. There was no money, there was no interest in taking a broader look and saying no, or at least there was very little. There was more mortgage originators. There was also a boom, of course, in the number of people who were handing out those loans. And there was the computerized models and all of that stuff, and the way that banks got involved. I don't know that I can speak to it that clearly. There was an entire sort of a shadow banking system that had been speculative, whereas in general the assumptions are that it's much more conservative. Reinhardt talks about this a fair bit. It made it all very difficult to manage all of that. And then, of course, as we know, things became too big to fail, right? There were too many financial institutions invested in this kind of speculation to let them take hits, because it would have crashed the economy, as we've heard. But it did major damage. Between January 1st and October 11th in 2008, owners of stocks in U.S. corporations had suffered $8 trillion in losses, as their holdings declined from 20 trillion to 12. Losses in other countries averaged about 40%. So all of that carries on. I'll cut to the conclusion. I think what was helpful to think of what was going on, that this delusion was largely built by us leaning into a reliance on a reputation that housing was secure that had basically not been true. It was a reputation that housing mortgages were good debt. There was a reputation from crediting agencies that they were actually doing their work. There was a reputation that AAA ratings meant something. There was a reputation that when a mortgage security was packaged and resold at a high rate of security, that seemed to be real. But what it really was a giant sort of pyramid of short-term gains by all parties built upon assumptions. So, mortgage evaluators were complicit, banking leaders were complicit, stockholders and investors who didn't look underneath their 401ks and were part of that were complicit. The government was certainly, and the lack of regulation was certainly complicit. An economy and a tax system that designs to get people into houses but refuses to do the work that lets working people earn a living wage is complicit. So the dream that we're all secure on time. To whom our deepest concerns are addressed matters less, I think, than what we draw up in ourselves and hold ourselves to. That matters most. Dear depth of our heart, dear God, Goddess, Spirit that animates life, may our government be good. May it first and foremost be good, and in the service of the greater good. May our government and all governments defend those most needing defending. May our government and leaders be the beacon around the world that it and they call itself and themselves to be, and at times of resolve and prudence even have been. May our government demand of itself the integrity that it expects back in respect. And may we as citizens demand it be that. May we love our country with the wild-eyed innocence Jesus sees in children and doves, and may we watch over its systems with the famous patience of the cunning serpent. May our government's elected officials remember who it works for, who it serves more quickly, more loyally than who paid for the last campaign. May it, as doctors do, in the effort to do some good, aspire to do no harm. May our government listen and itself pray for guidance and hold itself to having a clear conscience. May our government stop and ask itself if it and this is good, and if each act it sees itself as acting in the greater good. That is what I pray for, and that is what I pray we hold it to.